Hello. A question I'm asked more than I would like to admit is, so how do you pronounce your name? So here it is. It's not Urs, it's Oars. Think of an oar, Oars. That's right. And for those of you who speak Spanish or German, you can roll the R, Urs. But for the rest of us, Oars, the rowing oar. And for the language buffs among you, the root is actually Latin, Ursus, the bear. And then my last name is Koenig, which means king. So my parents did really name me the Bear King. So remember, not Urs, but Oars. Thank you.
Joseph Jaffe is not famous. Me, Tom Arnold, I am very famous. I absolutely like, because it's very true. Like, I hadn't freaking heard of you until I sitting on a Friday night. This is how bad my life is. Listen, fucker, good luck. Good luck with your rebranding. Like anybody knew what the name was before. What was the name? Okay, who gives a shit? That's a good name because it's got your name in it. You can pretend you're humble. You say, I'm not famous. And, which you aren't. So you're just not being anyway, but I hope you get famous doing this. Good luck to you.
When it comes to chicken, I'm your guy.
Blinking.
I'll have what Joseph's has.
Look, somebody's talking about you.
This is what we call the voice of God.
Popping.
Everybody just gets to focus on you.
Grab me.
Probably not the best thing for an introvert.
I'm asking for you.
Well, I like a good chicken sandwich.
Touch me. Hi, David. Comment.
Oh my God.
Like.
You're actually an identical twin.
Push.
Maybe I'll just ask Julie to talk about what it is to be an identical twin.
Pick me up.
No, you didn't.
Shouting.
Surprise! Jeremiah, just hang on a second. I just got a text.
There's an edit for your new opening, Joseph.
I feel really honored to have been here, man.
But by the way, you've done a masterful job. Seriously.
And it was such a joy.
Thanks, Joseph. It's an honor.
Good on you. This was a pleasure.
I mean, you are the prime example of how to pivot in this new environment.
I wish everybody gets an opportunity to interact with Joseph Jaffe.
Who needs Cameo when I've got my own personal Cameo? Well, welcome everyone to another. Look at me. I'm humbly not famous. Am I humble? Am I not humble? Am I arrogant? You know, my personal brand at one point, I guess people referred to me as quite arrogant, but maybe that was just me being insecure or trying to be confident. I love the fact that Tom Arnold, even though, you know, he had a little bit of a expletive over there. I hope Urs can handle that. But it was interesting how he kind of got the idea of not famous, and he said, because you can pretend I'm humble. I don't know, am I pretending or is it something that I'm growing into and learning about the power of humility versus hubris? Something to think about. Well, my guest on the show is Urs Koenig, the Bear King himself. King Bear. I'm excited. I just had Kim Scott on the show just a few weeks ago talking about radical candor, radical respect, and now it's radical humility. So we're getting all of the radicalization. The show has been radicalized. What the hell is going on? Forget about, I don't know, college campuses. The only real radical thinking you're going to find on this show, damn it. And you know, I have to tell you that it was, I guess it was meant to be. I was driving down the road and saw this, like literally today, 861 Urs. So I'm just surrounded by humility. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Well, anyway, I've been saying every single show in 2024, I've been manifesting my why statement as a teacher, facilitator, and coach. I help high aspiring entrepreneurs, owners, and their leadership teams get unstuck, return to growth, and become forever changed. Maybe I need to bring in the word humility into that as well. Why not? Why not? So a little bit on each one when it comes to this idea of being stuck. Well, the best thing to do is to get unstuck. And I actually started this show. It was called Corona TV. Now it's called Joseph Jaffe is Not Famous, in order to help people that were stuck at home or just stuck in general. And if you do like the show, please join join me, join the channel, subscribe to the channel, bit.ly/subscribe to the show. I would appreciate it very much. Share the word. And, you know, there have been 700 guests, including none as incredible as Urs Koenig. And yes, Urs, I say that to all the girls. What about this idea of growth? Well, the idea of growth is you can grow out, you can grow up, you can grow your market share, your profitability, you can grow your business, you can grow your number of customers, but you can also grow in terms of growth, in terms of prioritization, in terms of being able to, you know, by the way, Urs, he asked me if his book arrived. I said, unfortunately, it didn't. Of course it did. It's called Radical Humility. I love it. Be a badass leader and a good human. Not or, but and. So this whole idea of healthy and smart, EQ and IQ, it is possible. It is achievable. It is, I would argue, it is mandatory if you really want to be the kind of leader and create the kind of organization that attracts and retains your talent. And I have the privilege of actually being a coach, an implementer for EOS, helping companies grow or return to growth. And then finally, Forever Change, the title of my latest book, How a Global Pandemic Changed My Direction, My Purpose, and My Life. If you didn't change during the last 4 years, you wasted an opportunity amidst all of the instability and volatility and trauma. There were opportunities to create some kind of a metamorphosis, a transformation. And don't worry, there is still time. But now it's time for the seated soliloquy. And the seated soliloquy, Urs and I we were joking, not joking, we're chatting in the green room. And I actually said, this is one of the core values of EOS, where I am a coach, the idea of being humbly confident. Now, I'm not going to go into maybe the EOS definition of what it is to be humbly confident, but it's very interesting because in the book, in Radical Humility, it talks about one of the myths that you cannot be humble and confident at the same time. It busts that myth because indeed it is possible. Indeed it is probable. Indeed it is almost, again, requisite when it comes to this idea of fusing these two worlds together. Now, it is a tough one because early on in my career, when I was one of the first bloggers and marketing bloggers and podcasters in the world, my brand was almost about being brash and arrogant. And so the more people expected me to be a truth teller and be direct and even be a bit controversial, the more, I guess, I just started to drink my own Kool-Aid, my own crap, basically, and almost assumed that persona. You want arrogance, you'll get arrogance. You want hubris, you'll get hubris. But I'm not sure it ever was who I really was inside. Now, of course, the challenge, the catch-22, which is you need to be confident, you need to project confidence, you need to be able to not be a shell or a wimp or unsure of yourself. If you want to close that deal, if you want to go out there and be a keynote speaker, you've got to project confidence. But of course, that Achilles heel is being overconfident or almost perceiving or creating an image of being hubristic, of being arrogant. It is tough. We suffer from lack of confidence. We suffer from almost too much humility, if that can even be said. We suffer from imposter syndrome. We are constantly almost caught between a rock and a hard place. How much humility is enough? How much confidence is too much? Well, I don't need to answer those questions because I've got the guy who wrote the book on the subject, Urs Koenig, coming in just a few moments. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Urs is a former United Nations military peacekeeper and NATO military peacekeeping commander, a highly accomplished ultra-endurance champion, a widely published professor, best-selling author, and a seasoned executive coach and keynote speaker with more than 3 decades of experience helping hundreds of leaders and dozens of executive teams unlock new levels of achievement across 4 continents. He's the founder of the Radical Humility Leadership Institute and speaks frequently on the topic of leadership to corporations and associations across the globe. His message of radical humility in leadership has inspired teams from across the spectrum, including some of these small startups, Amazon, Starbucks, the Society of Human Resource Management, Vistage, the University of Melbourne, and Microsoft. Urs is the loving father of 2 teenage boys who make commanding soldiers look easy. He lives in Seattle, Washington. Urs, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Joseph. It's an honor to be here.
It is my pleasure. I have lots of little tricks and surprises up my sleeve, as you have already seen the introduction of. I love what you did, by the way, because that video is so simple and so powerful and makes such a great impression, and doesn't come across as maybe brash at all. You're almost helping someone, I suppose, not avoid the mistake where you have to correct them.
That's right. Otherwise people have to always ask me, and sometimes they don't want to ask up front, so they mispronounce my name for the first 10 minutes, and then they say, so how do I actually pronounce it? So yeah, it's hopefully helping people.
Well, let's get into the not the elephant in the room, but the bear king in the room. Thanks to AI, this is the rendition of you as the bear king. What do you think? Did we do you justice?
That looks almost a bit arrogant. I love the bear in the background much more than the guy, I have to say.
Well, look, he's the king of bears. He's the bear king.
Right.
So, let's vanquish him, shall we? No, I'm super excited to talk about this subject because I set it up in the soliloquy a little bit earlier. This idea of how much is too much, how little is too little, how do you find the balance? Let's go all the way to the beginning and talk about, and let me ask you this question. What is your definition of humility?
Right. So I've got sort of 3 legs to that stool of humility. So the first one is deep self-awareness. So seeing myself in line with how others see me. So self-knowledge, self-awareness. That's the first one. The second one is leading relationally versus simply by content expertise. So building meaningful and trusting relationships in my family, in my community, and with my team members at work. So that's the second one. And the third one is, embracing, what we call the growth mindset. So seeing mistakes and failures as an opportunity for learning and growing versus something to be ashamed of. And so that's sort of, in a nutshell, the quick and dirty definition of humility, which, based on my research and of course the work of many people before me who've looked at humble leadership.
Let's talk about each one for a second.
Yeah.
So self-awareness, the sense of almost being selfless, I suppose, which is being able to understand your position, your role, your presence in a dynamic, and maybe being able to take yourself out the equation in terms of understanding when perhaps you're being overbearing, you're not being honest enough. Am I in the right space?
Yeah, I think so. It's really pragmatic. It's knowing how I come across, right? So they're discovering my blind spots, right? The blind spots are the things everybody else knows about me, but I have no self-awareness around it. And the only way I can find out is by asking. So simple things we can do, and I, talk to my clients about, simply at the end of every one-on-one you have with your people, ask for feedback. How am I doing as a leader? What can I do better? I do this with my kids, actually. You mentioned I have 2 teenage boys, which truly make commanding soldiers look easy. I actually do ask them regularly, what can I do better as your dad, right? It doesn't mean that I then have to do everything they tell me. It's not a popularity contest, parenting or leadership, but I always ask, I always listen, I always thank. So that's one quick way to increase my self-awareness. So really understanding myself, my place in the world, and to your point, my place, in my organization, so that potentially I can, take myself out. I mean, that's another concept I talk about. The true test of leadership is how the ship runs when you're not there, right? So how can you make yourself obsolete? how can you take yourself out of the equation?
The second one is relationships. And when we think about the fact that we are building bridges, not burning them, when we think about everyone around us, there is an element of selflessness. But to me, this is the EQ versus IQ component, right? That it's not just about transactions. It's not just about performance. It really is about some softer metrics or measurables as well.
Absolutely. I talk about the concept of being tough on results and tender on people. So this notion that, I either have to be a nice person or a tough leader truly is a false dichotomy. We can all courageously do hard things in a human way. And, one easy and quick thing, which is never done enough, is actually in a leadership context, getting to know my people on a personal level, truly taking an interest in, if it's appropriate, what they're interested to do in their personal lives, and in a business environment, what are their career aspirations? Where do they want to be? Like, do I really understand for each of my team members where they want to be in a year and 3 and 5, and how can I support them to get there? So this notion of leading relationally, really getting to know my people, understanding them where they are on a personal and professional level is an absolute core element of leading with humility.
And then the third one is this idea of the growth mindset. And there's so many elements to this, right? This idea of not being as so precious, this ability to tolerate and embrace risk and failure, and not, I could go on, but let me hear in your words how you kind of interpret the growth mindset.
So the growth mindset is really looking at each of my failures, and instead of feeling, and we all have them, we all make mistakes constantly, and instead of feeling ashamed or, worse, sweeping it under the carpet, how can I reframe that failure, and how can I actually learn from that failure? And we it's a cliche, I know, but the real failure is to never put yourself in a position to fail, right? Failure is an integral part of reaching excellence. So if we don't risk failure, we're not actually chartering into new territory. So, and honestly, for me personally, that's the hardest shift. I grew up in a very competitive family, and I was told on numerous occasions, in our family, there's only A's in school, no B's and C's. So I grew up in this, perfectionism family. And so then for me to embrace the growth mindset and actually really embrace taking risks and making mistakes was actually on a personal level a hard journey to go through.
How did you actually make that transition from someone who was always demanded and demanding of yourself to be number one, to win the race, to obliterate your competition? What was the shift that led you to suddenly becoming champion for the other side?
The shift was really actually taking some small risks first and then bigger risks. For example, moving around the world twice and trying to establish myself. And I moved to Australia in my late 20s for my graduate work, and then to the US in my mid 30s. So that was a huge learning experience, and plenty of failures along the way. And I slowly and over time, and by the way, I'm still work in progress. There's no means do I say I handle the growth mindset perfectly. It's something I still have to work on a regular basis. So it's small steps up front and then bigger risks as I became more comfortable embracing that sometimes things just don't work out.
So this idea of small risks then bigger, is that almost like a formula to help people that are so afraid to take a chance or take a risk? And of course, it's all risk is relative, right? So what might be a big risk for you might not be such a big risk for me, and vice versa.
Oh, that's exactly right. Like, your reality is your reality, and there's never my place to assess if this is a hard risk for you or not. But you're absolutely right. It's these small steps. I know Amy Edmondson talks about this, and so do I. Do go out and start a new hobby. It sounds ridiculous, but that's actually one way to, in a safe place, to fail. I'm taking improv classes. I write about this in the book. It's a scary thing to do. It's a helpful skill to have as a keynote speaker, but that's a safe environment where you can fail. And so, take up a new hobby, sailing, paragliding. I took up recently, parasailing I did, and I failed plenty of times, but it was a sort of a confined space, a safe space. So that's absolutely one way where we can get more comfortable with taking risks and failing in a hobby.
I love that idea, which is, just do it. Start a new hobby and humble yourself for the most part. And it seems like, though, that would be something really good for someone who was struggling with humility. But most of us are, dealing with imposter syndrome, and we're swimming in insecurity. We're swimming in humility. We almost need to do the opposite, which is we need more confidence. We need more wins. It seems like a bit of a catch-22.
Well, but to be clear, insecurity and humility are not the same thing, right? And so coming back to the humble confidence up front. So I argue that you actually have to be fundamentally confident in yourself in order to show up with humility. So if we think about one aspect of humility is showing up with appropriate vulnerability, meaning sharing when I make a mistake, sharing my shortcomings. And if we think about it, only if I actually am fundamentally confident in who I am, have a strong sense of self, can I then, with humility, ask for feedback on what I can do better and share some of my shortcomings. So rather than being a contradiction, I actually think that the confidence and humility actually go hand in hand. And as you pointed out, it's not just a nice to have together, but it's a must have combination, confidence and humility.
So just to be very clear, it isn't chicken and egg. Which came first, humility or confidence? Confidence comes first. With confidence comes security. And with security comes the ability to then bring in a little bit of, it's not even vulnerability as much as it is, I think, empathy and the ability to create space for others around you, as opposed to the know-it-all, the blowhard that has to have all the answers. Now you can allow for a little bit more air in the room.
I think that's very well put. I mean, we all know the seemingly overconfident leader, arrogant leaders who are actually deeply insecure and sort of compensate their insecurity by being, brash and over the top and arrogant. So I actually think you're absolutely right. A strong sense of self, clarity about what I stand for, who I am, strong sense of self comes first, and then I can show up with humility and, yes, actually vulnerability, which I think is, vastly undervalued in the business world and also powerful in order to build trust. I mean, if I can share a quick story about my peacekeeping work in the Middle East, I had a commanding officer. And by the way, people are always surprised when I talk about humility in the military, because we often think people outside of the military as leadership in the military is just top-down command control, do as I say, because I tell you it's not true at all. So I had a commanding officer in the Middle East who opened the after-action review, the post-mortem, where we assess what we did well and what we didn't do well, with these words. She said, "I screwed that up, and I know it." And her owning her mistake with vulnerability up front then made it safe for all of us, her direct reports, to own our own screw-ups, our own mistakes. And in the process, trust increased in our team, and operations on the ground actually improved significantly because it was an actual real after action review. And we talk about in these best after action reviews are the ones where rank is switched off and humility is switched on, and with humility comes vulnerability.
I want to just touch on that again, because I think it's a metaphor, right? Rank is switched off and humility is switched on.
Yes.
So what that tells me is that there's got to come a time when we get real with one another, when we strip away the fancy titles, the seniority, the superiority, and we can just kind of get real with one another.
you're so right on. I mean, the best teams are the teams that are real, as you put it, or, as I would say, vulnerable together, so that the team can become invulnerable. So the best teams, if we think about, if your listeners and viewers think about the best teams I've ever been a part of, those are the teams where there's deep trust, and trust is built in showing up as your real self, regardless of rank. There's still, I have maybe responsibility as the head of the team for the overall outcome, but the best teams are the one where we show up with deep vulnerabilities, no question about it.
I was just like listening to you and thinking, wait a second, vulnerable and then invulnerable. Superman, right, is invulnerable. He cannot be killed, except of course, for kryptonite. Vulnerable is this ability. I mean, it's an amazing concept. It's like blowing my mind that these two words are actually just separated by IN, and we actually realize that there is a superpower associated with this idea of vulnerability as a means to an end. That's powerful stuff.
I love it. That's exactly. I mean, it's a superpower. It really is. So there is I talk about a study, a fascinating study in the book, where pairs of complete strangers are brought into a lab, and they're tasked with asking each other meaningful questions, such as, what does love and friendship mean to you? Or if you only had 1 year to live, what would you change? And so questions that, spur vulnerability and sharing of real stuff versus a small talk. And after 45 minutes, participants were asked to rank the level of trust they developed with their partner 45 minutes. And participants rated the level of trust about as high as the average level of trust they have with people in their lives. And some even rated it as high as the level of trust they have with their significant others. So the research is crystal clear. Vulnerability is the quickest way to build trust.
And I'll let that just land and sit with you for a moment. Vulnerability is the quickest way to build trust. But why? Why does vulnerability lead to trust? Or what happens when there is a fear that it's almost the piranha or it's in the water. I show you a little bit of blood, I show you a little bit of weakness, and next thing I know, I'm chum.
That's right. So that's why I, as the leader, go first, because the danger of that happening is much smaller than if one of the team members does it. And so, of course, Brené Brown is the queen of shame and vulnerability. And she famously said, vulnerability is the last thing I want to show you, but it's the first thing I'm looking for in you, right? So it's, this is why this is a thinking person sport, this leadership stuff, right? So it's reading the room, reading the situation, sharing a bit and seeing what comes back, and doing that dance. So that's how this works.
I love that. That's such a great line. I've never heard it before. Leadership is a thinking person sport. Now, is that an Urs original? Is that an Urs original?
I'm not honestly, I'm not sure. I mean, I've used it for 20 years now. So
I like it. Yeah. We're gonna, I'm
give you credit, right?
I'm humbly gonna give you credit for it. Here's another quote, speaking of quotes, which I really loved. Humility, I'm sure you know this one very well. It's from Rick Warren. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less.
Humility does not mean putting yourself down. It doesn't mean being an emotional doormat. So it's not about thinking less of yourself. It's thinking about, how can I take myself out of the equation? How can I, in a leadership environment, empower my people to make good, smart decisions? How can I, as I said earlier, take myself off the ship and see that the ship still runs well without me? So I love that quote.
That idea of being able to take yourself out. This comes into. I did, by the way, the self-assessment, and actually said, I can't believe it. It says I'm an arrogant son of a bitch.
That's right.
No, it didn't. So this was my result. 78 out of 100. but on the border of advanced radical humility, which I think, is on the border. I'm not sure I'm as advanced as I'd like, but let's just say I'm between intermediate radical humility and advanced radical humility. And Urs, what was so interesting about that is that a lot of the questions, or some of the questions, relate to this idea of control and trust and delegating, and being able to just release the reins just a little bit, and that's hard.
It's very hard. So, and yet, can I quote quickly? Uber Jolie, who I write about in the book, he was the turnaround CEO of Best Buy, and he's, famous for talking about pushing decision making as far down in the organization as possible. He, by the way, and I love that, he started his turnaround tenure at Best Buy working on the floor of a Best Buy store for a week with a name tag that read CEO in training. So, talk about humbly learning from the front lines and really understanding what the pain points were so he could turn the ship around.
It actually makes me think suddenly of that series, that reality series, Undercover Boss. Because, that is an exercise in humility in of itself. The fact that the CEO goes undercover and actually understands, at the rock face, can empathize, can actually feel, can experience what the brand really is from the inside out, and how few leaders actually are able to do that, or even have the means or the mechanism. And maybe why Undercover Boss struck a chord or struck a nerve, because of that I don't even want to call it coming down to earth, but this ability to be grounded maybe is a better way to describe it.
And by the way, we don't have to go to reality TV shows. Taco Bell does this. Every new corporate employee works at one of their fast food restaurants for a week, including the CEO. So, and every year they have to do a day. They open, they close, they clean, they do the food line, whatever. And it's a humbling experience, and it flattens hierarchies. It then makes it safer for people at the front lines to speak up about issues they have to the corporate folks. So it's happening in the real world. I know airline bosses who do the same thing. They work as flight attendants for a week or so.
I absolutely subscribe to that. I started my career working for a fast food chicken company, a QSR called Nando's Chicken Land, and it was something that everyone did as well, which is to grill the chickens, to work in the store. And it was one of the hardest things I ever did in my life. But this was absolutely a part of our culture. And I'll tell you a little story, if I may. I like the way you ask me. You're my guest. You can do anything you want. But may I tell you a story?
I would love to hear your story, Joe.
So I arrived in the US in 1997. I worked at Ogilvy on IBM. And I was working on small and medium business, and the products that we were basically selling were the PC server, the AS400, the RS6000. And I said to my boss at the time, can I go to an IBM factory or facility and just see how they make the machines and actually be a part of it? And, and my boss kind of laughed at me and said, no. And I said, why? And they said, you don't need to actually understand how the machines work. It's just advertising. And it was just, it hurt. It hurt so much, because that was me taking that idea of how am I going to be able to represent this fully and accurately if I'm not at the rock face. It was a shame and a pity, because, otherwise all I was doing is, I don't know, just putting copy on a page and pretty pictures and hoping to dupe people into buying this stuff.
So you were never able to go to a factory?
I never went. But for me, that would have been the first thing that I would have done.
Yeah, and that's why they lost you eventually, right? So that's actually a really wonderful concept you talk about, which I'm feeling very passionate about, creating learning opportunities for our team members outside their immediate area of expertise. So, when I had my peacekeeping command in Kosovo, I would do this regularly, have my team shadow people, take outside of our immediate team, take part in a meeting or go on a specific trip to learn stuff outside of what we were doing within our team. And what happens when people are able to do that, when we create learning opportunities, they get a better understanding of the big strategic environment. And if they do that, then they make better, bigger decisions on our behalf. And so empowerment and delegation becomes that much easier when our folks understand the big picture. So I love that you initiated that, but bummer that the boss wasn't able to make it happen for you.
Urs, I want to talk about how to. I wonder if the question is, can you teach humility? Can you learn humility, the nature versus nurture? But the bigger question is, how do we instill a sense of humility in our leaders? And I'm not actually just referring right now to leaders of a company. I'm talking about leaders of a country. I'm talking about Congress. I'm talking about the fact that right now it doesn't appear that that leaders are necessarily in touch with people. How do you create that sense of humility?
Well, it's like everything else. There needs to be a willingness on the person's part to actually want to learn whatever it is, including become more humble. And so I would argue that, not to talk about politics, but there's very limited willingness on a lot of our political leaders to actually become more humble. I mean, I have very concrete, actionable ideas and exercises in the book on how we can become more humble, including how to ask for feedback, how to build relationships, how to embrace this, these failures, this growth mindset. But, you and I know we both coach. You can coach, until the cows come home. Somebody who doesn't want to change, nothing will ever change. So there needs to be a willingness on the other person's part to do the work and actually become more humble.
So let's talk about that word willingness for a second, because I think that implies that there is an awareness, right? Going back to your three, right? The idea of self-awareness, growth mindset, and relationships. The willingness, because clearly if someone is unwilling and or unable, they choose not to. But I think that almost gives them too much credit to actually even have that awareness. It appears that when there is denial, when there is detachment, when there is a separating of themselves with the reality, that they might not even be aware enough to choose to be unwilling. Or am I being naive?
Oh, I think if I understand you correctly, Joseph, I think you're right. The higher we rise, the less we hear the truth. Right?
Yes.
Absolutely. And so the best senior leaders, and again, in politics, in government, in business, the best senior leaders make a point. They understand that people don't actually laugh at your jokes. They laugh at the jokes that your position is making. They don't laugh at Urs's or Joseph's joke. They laugh at the CEO's joke or the president's joke, right? So what we then need to do in a position of power like that is surround ourselves with people who are not just yes people, but who actually tell us the truth. And the best leaders, politics, business, government, non-for-profits, do exactly that. Like they have the truth sounding board, the people who tell them what's actually going on versus just nodding and laughing at the jokes.
So I feel very strongly about this point. And in my fifth book, Built to Suck, I actually spoke about one of the undoings at GE, which was success theater. The chairman at the time surrounding themselves with yes people, and in fact, creating a mandate that no bad news could be shared ever at any time. And so the sycophants, the enablers, create this bubble, and the result is almost inevitable demise.
That's exactly. I mean, that's the opposite of the growth mindset. If we only want to hear about the good stuff, what happens to failures and mistakes? Because they always happen. They go on the ground. And, as you pointed out, that's probably the demise of GE. That's it.
Who does it really well? individuals, companies, governments?
Nadella at Microsoft is a prime example. I mean, if you think back to the Steve Ballmer, who, dare I say, actually has Swiss roots, command control, one could argue a bully, how Nadella changed the culture at Microsoft based on his own core values, learning, curiosity, and a growth mindset. It's part of the corporate learning at Microsoft, actually, humility. So Microsoft is a prime example in my book.
Give me another example. What about an individual, not necessarily in a corporate environment, someone that you believe espouses these tenets, these core values of humility?
So, can I give a military example? Actually,
yeah, sure.
General McChrystal, who wrote the book Teams of Teams. So he realized that to fight Al Qaeda, when he was head of the task force fighting terror in the Middle East, then they had everything. The Allied forces, better equipment, better training, more people, but they couldn't win. So he changed the way he led and structured his task force, and he talks about leading like a gardener. So instead of like a chess master from the top controlling his pawns on the chessboard, he led like a gardener, a humble creator of the right environment. As a gardener, we can't actually make our plants grow, right? Much like none of us, we can't make our people do what we want. But what we can do is we create the right environment, the right culture. And McChrystal was one of the first military leaders who embraced humble leadership. He didn't call it that, but relationship building, the open sharing of information, and he got into trouble sometimes with the intelligence community because he shared so much more than any other military leader. And in the process, the task force became measurably more effective. So, and McChrystal on a personal level, is actually a humble guy. There's no question about that. The first one to admit, I'm no superhuman.
I love that example. And actually, one of the things I focused on a lot, again, going back to Built to Suck, was this idea of what I called embrace your heresy in order to create your legacy. The 12th man, as in Dragon Ball Z, red teaming, this whole notion of just when you think you figured it all out, you have someone who is a contrarian, someone come in and say, what if we're all wrong? What if there is a better way? If we don't put ourselves out of business, someone else will.
Right.
And to me now, I see there's elements there grounded in humility, because it implies that that little bit, that seed of doubt can be super, super healthy if using the analogy of the garden, if planted, correctly, as opposed to becoming weeds. I'll stop the metaphor there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I often talk about that as well. So when, our teams come to us with a decision, and so we want to do that, right? And so the first question we should always ask is, what did the contrarian say? And if they say we all agreed, then, then there needs to be more digging. So I always ask, what did the people who don't agree with the decision actually say? So that's to your point as well.
There is a core element of this thesis, of this philosophy, which is the ability to actually, if I had to put down two words to describe it, it would be just ask. Ask for feedback. Ask how did we do today? How can we be better? It blows my mind, Urs, just the ability as a father, as a husband, to go to my kids or my wife and just say, how can I be a better husband? How can I be a better father? What can I do differently? It's so simple, and in its simplicity, it's brilliant.
It's so simple, and it's not easy, right? It's not, but I love what you said. Just ask. Summarize the whole thing in two words. That's exactly right. And I know I said it earlier. I think leadership is not a popularity contest. It doesn't mean that you do everything that people tell you. I certainly don't do everything my boys tell me I should do differently as a dad, but I always ask. And more often than not, I can really learn something valuable.
Okay, so now let's just take that one step further. You get feedback, you get advice. now you got to decide what to do with it. One of the things that I often say to startup founders is I say, 50% of the time, you're going to get a lot of advice, right? You're going to ask, you're going to get advice. Sometimes you won't ask and you'll still get the advice,
exactly,
right?
exactly,
From investors,
yes.
right? So I say to them, 50% of the time, nod your head, thank them, look very, very authentic, and absolutely ignore them and even do the opposite.
Yeah.
50% of the time, do what they say to the letter, to the dotted I and the cross T. The art is in knowing when to listen and when to kind of internalize it and when to reject it. How do you find that balance when attempting, or in this kind of rubric of trying to be more humble or less arrogant?
So I think I love your advice, by the way, and I absolutely agree with the thesis of 50% of the stuff you should actually do and 50% you should ignore. But it doesn't mean that you don't acknowledge and you don't thank for the input. I mean, I'm very pragmatic in that department, so I get a lot of advice, and then I have a core group, a core board of directors, we can call it, informal even, where I workshop the advice. And, I might have a gut feeling first, and then I go to my core group and I get their take on, what they think I should act on and I shouldn't. So everybody's different. I process by talking things out loud. There's, journaling is something more for an introvert that can help with that as well. So I think that's some of the ways where we distinguish what we should actually act on and what we shouldn't.
Yeah, it strikes me that there's a follow-up to that, which is actually quite literally the follow-up, which is to ask questions, i.e., you don't say i.e. in a talk show, but I just did. But another core value, which is curiosity.
Yeah.
So being able to go a little bit further, even if that piece of advice is not necessarily landing, understanding its root cause, understanding the justifications or the rationalization, or being able to take it further. So how important is curiosity in this framework of humility?
You can tell I want to jump in. I love that. So important. And the listening piece. So that's actually, I sort of may differ a little bit from you. You say, nod your head and look seriously. I would actually really push us to always listen with as much intent as we possibly can to really understand where the other person is coming from. And actually, let's try it on. Let's actually say we do that and then follow-up questions. What does it mean? And that build it out together, just as a thought experiment to really understand where the other person is coming from. And, in your example, the idea or the advice that the other person is bringing, what are the assumptions? What are the potential consequences? Did we think through everything? And then we make it's a no-brainer, right? We make much better decisions. We can much more intelligently decide if it makes sense or not. So listening, is an important piece of the psychologically safe culture of the growth mindset, like truly listening. And I'm assuming you teach that in your coaching as well, like the listening, not just to respond, the listening not just with my own agenda, but actually truly understanding where you're coming from and addressing what you're bringing to me.
It's one of the reasons why I have no questions or show notes, because how do I know what you're going to say and which direction we're going to end up in? For example, one of the things you said that has helped you become more humble is improv. So I jotted down another thought of humor me, right? Like humor me. Let's continue to have the conversation. Or maybe you're humoring the other person by allowing that conversation to extend. But it seems like another personality trait is this idea, I would call it being self-deprecating, but this ability to not take yourself so seriously, to just allow, sometimes just allow that little bit of criticism, not to take the criticism, personally, as like we talk about constructive criticism, but most people, they just can't deal with the constructive part because they're so overwhelmed by the critical part.
Yeah, we have a negativity bias as humans, right? We focus on the negative stuff. There's no question about it. I think you're absolutely right. again, coming back to this notion of confidence, I need to have a strong sense of self. I need to be fundamentally confident in myself in order to truly hear, as you put it, the constructive criticism, the negative feedback I potentially hear, and then act on that, and not, blow it out and and then go into sort of the extremism, and I'm terrible, I'm and all the negativity downward spiral, which I know personally, if I'm honest, that can happen to me. There's no question about it. And so I need to have a strong sense of self to actually hear that negative feedback.
In the book, you talk about dispelling some myths, and that's actually where I saw the funny connection between humble and confidence. So myth number 1, leaders cannot be both humble and confident. Dispel.
Well, I think I did. So, I need to be fundamentally confident to hear the negative feedback and then act on it. I need to actually have a strong sense of self to hear it. So yeah, I think
confident, right? Confident first, humility.
Yeah,
second.
exactly.
That comes next.
Exactly.
Number 2, leaders cannot be both humble and decisive.
Well, so that actually goes back to Jim Collins's work, who first wrote about humble leadership in Good to Great. So, the best humble leaders are the ones who don't take themselves, to your point earlier, too seriously, but who, in the interest of the organization, of our team, make hard, tough decisions. So there's absolutely no contradiction, but they go hand in hand.
And then the third myth, leaders cannot be both humble and ambitious.
So it requires actually humility to ask the hard, deep questions like, why am I failing? Why is my team failing? Why is my organization failing? And what's my part in this? But only if we ask these hard questions, do we actually achieve success? And so I need to have humility to ask the difficult, hard questions. But if I don't ask the difficult, hard questions, I won't, I'm not ambitious and I won't succeed. So again, hand in hand, not a contradiction at all.
All right. Now there are 2 surprising truths. Surprising truth number 1. I am the captain, but I'm not better than anyone else.
So are you referring to Marquette's work in there?
That's a good question. You tell me. Sam Walker, in his painstakingly thorough book, The Captain Clause, a new theory of leadership.
The captain, right. Yeah. So this is actually an interesting one. So professional sports, right? So we think about what makes the best sports teams. Plenty of money, the best coaches, lots of talent, the best, none of the above. The best sports teams across all time and all of sports, rugby, football, basketball, soccer, they actually have one thing in common, which is a humble captain. So Carla Overbeck, the former U.S. women's soccer captain, she was a defender, but she only scored 7 goals in her entire international career, which even for a defender is very low. And on and off the field, displayed great humility. She often would schlep her teammates' bags to their room after some especially grueling flight. And of course, under her leadership, the U.S. women's soccer team, achieved the amazing success they had. So I'm not the captain. But I'm the captain, but I'm not better than anybody else. So the best sports teams across all of time and all of sports, according to that research, actually have that one thing in common, a humble captain.
And then the surprising truth number 2, humility makes you smarter.
This one I remember. I wrote the book. I should remember stuff, right, Joe?
Listen, it happens. I sometimes I'm reading my own book and I'm like, did I say that? That was pretty smart. Wait, is that being humble? No.
So this is I love this one. This is a study out of the University of Washington here in Seattle, actually. And it showed that the best predictor of a student's final grade is not hard work, not smarts. It's actually being humble. The ability to accurately assess how much studying I need to do, and probably more than you think, hint, and the ability to ask for and act on feedback from fellow students and professors. And so humility was an even better predictor than mental smarts for a student final grade, aka smart, mental ability, aka smarts. So humility actually makes you smarter. And I often joke about this in my speeches. Humility equals free ride to Stanford.
Well, that's an interesting one. But you know, the other part of it again comes back to the vulnerability is just the ability to ask for help.
Yeah.
I haven't figured it out. I'm not as in control as I'd like to believe. Please help me.
You know, and I think so, you know, as I shared, I have teenage boys, and the schools these days do such a good job in general, much better than when I went to school many, many moons ago, of helping our kids to self-advocate. Do exactly that. Ask for help. Ask for feedback. How can I do better? I talk about this in my book. My younger son, Liam, had a geography project that was not great. And then he did exactly that. He went to his teacher, he went to fellow students and looked at how they did it and asked his teacher for better feedback, for feedback on how he could do better. And his final grade improved significantly. So I actually think we're doing a much better job these days in our education system than when I was young.
Well, I think you've done a, I'm gonna grade you a 9.9 out of 10, because if I gave you 10, it would, it would go to your head, and maybe that little bit of humility and vulnerability of saying, wait a second, was this in my book? is all part of the humanity. We didn't get to play Two Truths and a Lie, but if we had, we would have actually found out that this was your lie, ironically. And I say ironically because here you are as a professional footballer. This is a lie, of course, but there you are as the captain, the humble captain, or as it was all meant to be.
Next to Ted Lasso. I just love that. And Roy Kent. Yeah, so good.
Exactly. Now this is actually true, which is you've been a competitive ultra endurance athlete your entire life. What has that taught you about being a competitive ultra endurance athlete in terms of informing this whole thinking around humility?
So one of the biggest things, it sounds like a cliche, but it's true, is this taught me to fail successfully. I had some pretty significant failures. One actually almost cost me my life during an ultra race, and reframing that failure and coming back. So that's one thing. Another thing, specifically in ultra endurance competitions, they go over several days and nights, and you'll feel like, excuse my French, shit. You know that you will at one stage, and you also know that it will get better again. So if you're in the deepest valley and you think that's the end of the world, from experience, because you've been there before, that you keep riding, you keep running or walking or crawling, it will actually get better again. When the sun comes up, 5 a.m., 6 a.m. on the third day, you'll feel better again. So those two things are the biggest learnings.
So digging deep, the darkest hour is just before dawn, but also a little bit of experience, having done it before and having the faith and belief in terms of the fact that the outcome will materialize at the end.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Been there, done that. And of course, the first time, you just need to trust in the process of having learned from your coaches and fellow competitors.
Well, I don't want to say from the sublime to the ridiculous, but the final element, which actually is true, is that it took you 23 years of living in the US to finally become a US citizen last December. What's the learning? What's the learning there in terms of passing your exam and maybe just kind of becoming this idea? I suppose you and me, we both have funny accents. We'll always be thought of to a degree as foreigners or outsiders. Maybe that keeps us constantly humble. I don't know.
Yeah, probably. I think so. This is an interesting one, if I may just quickly. So I've been, on a green card for many years. My boys have given me a hard time for a long time. I can't really whine about American politics if I don't, vote. And so that was a good point. But when I was deployed to the Middle East, sort of that's a more philosophical one. I learned firsthand the immense influence that American, even domestic politics have on what's going on in the world. Like literally the Hezbollah guys wouldn't fire RPGs into the Israeli positions because they were waiting on what's going on in the American Congress. When I was working in Egypt, in the Sinai, the Americans were the only people who would, still do aid work in the Sinai because of, everybody else said it's too dangerous, ISIS there, whatever. And so I felt, even though I wasn't a citizen at the time, actually a sense of pride, which, many of the cynics maybe, argue that there's so much bad stuff that happened with American foreign policy. But I felt a sense of pride to live in America because I saw the lot of good things that are happening in the world because of America. So that actually made me decide then on an emotional level to finally become a citizen.
And we're glad that you became a citizen. I speak on behalf of the entire United States of America. I still, when people say to me, they go, "And where are you from?" Right. I go, "Connecticut. Where are you from?" When I know they're actually just trying to say, what country am I from? So please humor me. Just ask. Well, thank you for asking. I'll tell you the answer. If you want to figure out the importance of humility in leadership, say I'm just bringing it all together right now. You're going to want to read follow Urs. You're going to want to read some of his amazing thinking on radical humility. It doesn't have to be so radical, but maybe that will give you the shot in the arm that you need. You can follow him on Instagram. You can follow him on X. Book him as your keynote for your next event, and you can find out more at urskoenig.com. The Bear King. The Bear King. The Bear King is ready to keynote your next event. Of course, you can buy Radical Humility, be a badass leader, and a good human. They are not mutually exclusive. And I'll tell you one person who I don't know, maybe is humble in real life, but in terms of the lore and the myth associated with him, there is anything but humility, as the saying goes. Why does lightning not strike the same place twice? Because Chuck Norris is looking for it. And here's what Chuck had to say about you, Urs.
You are Chuck Norris approved.
And we will be back soon. You better. Otherwise, he's going to come looking for you.
That's right.
Take care, everyone. And I'll be back soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Thank you for watching the show about hope, positivity, optimism, and if there's time left over, a little bit of marketing with your host, multiple author, and global keynote speaker, Joseph Jaffe. If you like the show, tell a friend or two. Please subscribe to the show. And if you want to get inside news, previews of upcoming guests, and much more, visit JosephJaffe.com/subscribe to sign up for the show's newsletter.
And despite the best ministrations of your wife, you still look ugly.